Good evening. It's, it's a real pleasure to see all you people out this morning. I'd hate to send y'all to the principal's office for talking out of turn, but if y'all just keep on, I'm going to do it. Just no, silly. It's really a wonderful crowd to come in here, Kathryn Braund. But first, let me thank the First Alabama Bank for sponsoring this series. And if you see Chris Kramer, tell him, and he'll tell Chad Jones, and the word will eventually get to the people who count. Chris, raise your hand. We want to welcome Dr. Braun to Sylacauga and to this series. We're thrilled to have her back because, she's just one of the finest historians that you could ever find anywhere, especially her Indian studies. It makes her know more about the Indian history and Southern history and what have you than anyone that I know of. And I'm talking about the correct part. They didn't see it on a Saturday evening thing with Gene Autry and Roy Rogers. But Kathryn is a Holyfield Professor of Southern History at Auburn University. She has a BS degree from Auburn, and she did her doctorate at Florida State. But her research has been in the 18th and 19th century of both the Creeks and the Seminoles. And it's just really exciting. One of the things that she did is she has co-authored and edited Deerskins and Duffels, the Creek Indian Trade with Anglo-America. And then the thing today, William Bartram and the Southeastern Indians, which is something well, she can tell you about that. But, and most recently, The Attention of a Traveler, essays on William Bartram's travel and legacy is one of her productions. So we're just thrilled, and you're going to know more about Alabama, you're going to know more about plants, and you're going to be more excited than you've been in a long time. So turn off your cell phones and let's welcome Dr. Braun's story of what a traveler saw when he came through here riding a horse and blazed the trail of what is mostly the state of Alabama. You've always wondered what it looked like in 1600. You're fixing to find out. Thank you, Kathryn. We're delighted to have you.
So much. That was sweet. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Ted, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to break the cardinal rule handbook, and that is I'm going to turn my back on you because I forgot to get my reading glasses out of my purse, which is back here. So excuse me just a second. And I'm glad I remembered to put them in. Well, many of you may wonder who was William Bartram. And so I want to tell you a little bit about him, but what I really want to do today is whet tight because I want you to read what Bartram himself had to say. So William Bartram was a native of Philadelphia. His family farm is now a historic site. It's just outside Philadelphia, and you can visit there, and it's a wonderful place. So his father was one of the best known, if not the best known, botanist in the British colonies and owned a nursery business and would export American plants to gardeners in Great Britain. These are the big stately homes who were interested in presenting big beautiful gardens as a matter of status, and these men collected plants as a matter of pride. And so this was the family he grew up in. And so he was a self-taught botanist, but he was also an artist and a writer. And in 1773, he got funding from Dr. John Fothergill of London, who at that time had the largest private botanical garden in England, to go on a trip to the southern colonies to collect plants, as Fothergill put it, rare and useful productions of nature. And what they really wanted were pretty things to put in their gardens, like azaleas. And if you know anything about English gardens, they have very few trees. So American trees were very important to their gardens, as well as shrubs. And so that's what Bartram was sent off to find. It was not his first trip to the South. He had been a merchant in North Carolina for a while, made a shambles of the business. He wasn't good at the merchant. He had settled in East Florida in 1770, the 1770s, when it had become a British colony. bombed out on that. So here he is, kind of early middle age. This is him much older. Um, Early middle-aged man, had been several business failures, and so off he goes on a long and difficult journey that eventually, we figure, was about 2,400 miles. He went through 5 British colonies and the territories of 3 of the largest Indian tribes of the region. Now, you can kind of see through this purple line. There it is. So this is kind of where he went. A series of journeys all the way down into Florida on the St. Johns, up into the Cherokee Nation, and then what's interesting to us today, from Augusta, Georgia, down the great trading path across the Chattahoochee River, around the lower Tallapoosa, and what I like to think of as the I-65 of its day, this lower trading path, and there was not one thing on that path except nature. There were no settlements of any kind. It was a rough jaunt, and he got all the way down to Mobile, went on a little boat trip for a quick trip to Pensacola, got all the way to the father of the waters, the Mississippi, and then had to come back, and off to Philadelphia he went. He was traveling, I said 1773 when he left. This is obviously, that date will ring a bell with you. It's right in the heart of the beginnings of the American Revolutionary era. The region was in turmoil. And so the end of his 4-year journey, he ended up back in Philadelphia in the heart of the bitter war between the colonies and England. But during that time, he crafted his travel narratives into a book, which he eventually published in 1791. And you see from the title there, Travels Through the North and South Carolina, Georgia, East and West Florida. I mean, the title is really long, which kind of fills you in on what the book is about. And if you haven't read Travels, have any of you read the book, Bartram's Travels? All right, that's your assignment for the coming week. There will be a test next week. Bartram was not only a botanist and an artist, but he was a writer of unparalleled merit. And I'm going to tell you why you have to read Bartram, because one of America's leading literary scholars once wrote that Bartram's Travels is one of the most delightful books anybody ever read. And it really is. And it's a frustrating book, too, because he breaks into long lists of birds he's seen. He'll break into what can only be described as a prayer. He was a very devoted Quaker, praising God and nature and man's hospitality to man. And, so it's a jumble. And then he'll say, and then we set off the next morning, and he'll tell you where he's going. So you've got to read it, because he gives descriptions of plants and animals and wonderful places, from the Smoky Mountains to the sinkholes of Florida. And he described the people he met along the way. And he met people from high to low. He met the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs. He had lunch and dinner with colonial governors. He rode along these trade paths with deerskin traders. He met enslaved people, and of course he had a lot of interaction with native people. And they gave him a name. They called him Puck Puggy, the flower hunter. And he was welcomed into their towns because really he wasn't after anything except information, and he talked about plants. And they recognized, I think, a man of good heart when he went through. So how we know how most people come to know Bartram is through this book, the Naturalist Edition of Travels by Francis Harper. It's still available in paperback from the University of Georgia Press, and there are all kinds of versions of this, and you can go to most bookstores or Amazon and get the copies there. But Francis Harper in the early 50s went around through what we think of as Bartram country, and he got people there in every region who knew the area, and they nailed down Bartram's exact journey. We know exactly where he went, right down to which salt lick he's talking about, and his chronology. And that chronology was hard to work out, because Bartram was writing a lot of this from his journals, but also memory, and particularly in the region of Florida, when he went this day trip and that day trip and here and there, and he just kind of collapsed them all into one journey for what we might call narrative drama. So teasing all that out and working out where he was kind of a job, and Harper managed to do that. And Harper also published some of his letters and so forth. Now, Bartram was relatively unknown in the South outside the scientific communities until the bicentennial of the American Revolution. Who remembers our celebration of America's bicentennial? Raise your hand if you're young enough to remember that. The painted fire hydrants that look like little Minutemen, all that kind of stuff. All right, Bartram provided a connection for Southerners to the colonial and revolutionary era. Now, obviously in South Carolina and places in Georgia, there were some battles and things, but for most of the South, that we just didn't have that kind of memory of the American Revolution as they would say in Philadelphia, New York, or Boston. In the South, everybody was Civil War, Civil War, Civil War, and I think a lot of people were really surprised to find that there was actually a history before that. And so Bartram's journey was really a touchstone which connected the South to this colonial and revolutionary world. And I might add, it was a pleasant story, right? It's a travel journey. And so numerous groups all across the South got together, everyone from ladies' gardens clubs to the growing environmental movement, the tourism commissioners of various states, and in the mid-70s formed something called the Bartram Trail Conference, which, by the way, was first formed right here in Alabama. That's where the first meetings were. And so the purpose of this group was to raise awareness of Bartram's trip across the South and to identify historic as well as natural landscapes that were worthy of promotion and preservation. And in Alabama, the Bartram Trail Conference, as I said, that map's not too good, but you can get this map online. I'm going to tell you the place you can go. Bartram's trip through Alabama, this is his corridor, and there are several major Bartram sites. The Tuskegee National Forest very early on established a hiking trail for hikers. And called it the Bartram Trail. Fort Toulouse-Jackson Park, which is near Wetumpka, which Bartram did visit. It was in ruins there, the French fort. He visited there. But the crown and the jewel is this one, the Five Rivers Delta Center in the Tensas Delta, which has a series of canoeing trails. And if you like to canoe, I would suggest you go down there. The Five Rivers Delta Center is just marvelous for bird watching and canoeing and kayaking and all that sort of stuff. And so the Bartram Trail Conference keeps Bartram alive. And if you travel across the South, you'll see gobs of historic markers that basically say William Bartram visited here and whatever, and he saw a persimmon tree or whatever it was, you know. So a lot of local pride in where he went. And all these Bartram sites are the result of private, state, and federal efforts, as you saw on the thing. And if you would like to join the Bartram Trail Conference and come canoeing with me, just go to bartramtrail.org and you can get lots of information about Bartram and where he went across the South. So that's basically where he went. But back in the day when he was still alive, he wrote a lot about the Indians. For a long time, he was just known as a botanist. I think he's very valuable as a historical source too, and I know he is. And he had not only the travel journals that he published, but he sent reports back to his patron that were, written like right on the spot at his campsite, which has a lot of detail about native peoples, their life, their agriculture, that kind of thing. And then later, I want to touch on this. Later in life, during the administration of George Washington, he wrote something called Some Hints and Observations Concerning the Civilization of the Indians or Aborigines of America. And that ultimately became the basis of George Washington's Indian policy, his first Indian policy, the Civilization Program, for better or worse. So he has a very profound influence. And if you'd like to forget the botany, Greg Wasilkoff and I did kind of what's the unthinkable. We threw out all the list of birds and the meditations and things like that, and just collected everything Bartram had written about the Indians or his time on the path and put it in that book. So that's shameless promotion. But Bartram wrote a lot about the Indians, and his writings tell us a lot about the South. Now, this is a construction of something called the Stuart Gauge map, and if you go to the Alabama Department of Archives and History, you can see it. But the Stuart Gauge map was done by cartographers in the 1770s by the British Indian Department, and it details where towns were and where trails were. And you can see this is kind of where Bartram was going along this path. That's the Chattahoochee, and right around here, and then down to Mobile and back. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what he saw today. And there's the original of that map. And I have to say, I study 18th century maps. And for guys who are going around on horseback, taking their measurements and mileage and in secret because the native people were suspicious of what they were doing, it's an incredibly accurate map. You don't get more accurate maps than that until late in the 19th century. It's just amazing, this huge manuscript map of our area. Sylacauga is way up there somewhere. But so when Bartram reached our part of the world, as he put it, it was when the Declaration was being announced. And that declaration, of course, is the Declaration of Independence. So all of this discussion was going on. And as you see, he reached the Chattahoochee River in July of 1775. Open warfare had already broken out between the colonies and Britain by then. You know, that happened before the Revolution. The backcountry was in turmoil. The superintendent of Indian Affairs had been forced from his house in Charleston and was in exile in St. Augustine. Bartram had letters of introduction from the superintendent of Indian Affairs. He also had letters of introduction from George Golphin, who the Americans had appointed as the new Indian commissioner. So Bartram was in a tight spot when people were beginning to choose sides, and the deerskin traders themselves were worried about how are we going to get our goods out of the country, because there are non-importation agreements, there were embargoes. So they were businessmen, and so they were in a mess trying to figure out, how are we going to save our skins during this period of political turmoil and so forth. And so this is the backdrop to Bartram's trip, and he leaves the Tallapoosa in July of 1775. He gets down to the Mississippi, and he's back to Mobile by November 1775. And by January 1776, he's leaving the Upper Creek towns. And again, the place is in turmoil because the Americans and the British are putting pressure on the Indians. Don't get in the fight. We're going to need your help in the fight. And so it's a very tense situation. Even so, Bartram called it a very delightful country. But he didn't stay long. The traders were on actual business, and they were all hurrying to get their deerskins to market, to try to settle their debts, to try to figure out what was going on. There was competition, and there were, people were trying to assassinate people who were on the other side. I think we don't realize in the South how bad the Revolution was. There weren't that many big clashes of armies, but it was a low-level, very bitter person-on-person warfare in Georgia and the Carolinas, and even in the Indian country. And of course, not only that, the Creeks had their own little problem, which was a war with the neighboring Choctaws over hunting territory. So everywhere he turned, there was turmoil. So even despite all that, he left an incredible account of the Creek towns and their inhabitants. And I'd like to start with one man he met at a beautiful little town called Coulommiers. And that man is James Germany. He was a deerskin trader. And Coulommiers was the last village on the south side of the Tallapoosa River before the trade path headed south for Mobile. So think of that, area around Tallahassee before you get to Montgomery and you're going down. That's about the area it was in. And Bartram was only there for 2 days because, as I said, this huge caravan he was traveling with, literally dozens and dozens of horses, was in a hurry. Now, Mr. Germany wasn't your usual deerskin trader. He was a respectable businessman. He had a license. He was also an interpreter for the British government for the Creeks. The Creeks trusted him. And the few surviving letters we have from him to officials and his business partners mark him not only as a literate man, but an educated one and a very skilled man in diplomacy. And so this is the kind of people that you find scattered in the Creek country. You get some, the bad egg, but you also get people like Mr. Germany who were men of means. And when I say means, I mean real means in 18th century terms. Not only did he have a big plantation in the Creek country, which include enslaved African Americans, but he also owned land in Georgia. And Bartram provides a very concise description of Mr. Germany, of his town and his family. And Bartram wrote in his book, Mr. Germany, by this time, was an elderly gentleman, but active, cheerful, and very agreeable. He received me and treated me with the utmost civility and friendship. His wife is a Creek woman, of very amiable and worthy character and disposition. She is industrious, prudent, and affectionate, and by whom he has had several children. He wants to send them to Savannah or Charleston for their education, but cannot prevail on his wife to consent to it. This affair affects him very sensibly, for he has accumulated a pretty fortune by his industry and commendable conduct. And obviously, he wanted his kids to have some accounting background and have a good tutor in Charleston, teach them how to manage his property. And these would have been Creek children, right? And I want to point out something here. Even though their father was British, they were 100% Creek because they had a Creek mother and they had a Creek clan. And in that society, they were Creek citizens, right? So let's restate in terms that Mr. Germany probably understood, but Bartram didn't quite get. Mr. Germany's property in the Creek Nation, even the enslaved people, were the property of his wife. Yeah, that sounds good, doesn't it, ladies? Yeah. The household was hers under Creek law and custom. And by household, I mean everything, the horses, whatever is there, and his house and his store. So she had control of the goods, which meant, I like to think the deerskin traders like to keep their wives happy because if she wasn't happy, there goes your supply. And she and her matrilineal clan, as Bartram was told, had absolute control over the upbringing of the children. It would have been her brother who had a say about whether or not those children were sent out of the Creek Nation, which would have been a dangerous kind of thing, but because of disease and everything else. So a lot of people were hesitant to let their children go off into that kind of thing. Although I am betting that Germany had taught them to read and write and gave them the benefit of his education. But that's a very interesting story of a family, and Bartram knew some of it. The town itself, let's see, which Bartram sketched what he called a characteristic town of the Creek Nation, as you see here. And Bartram said this was a beautiful town, a beautiful new town. It had only been recently built. And he was not the only one who described it as a very pleasant place. In his first tour of the Creek towns about 20 years later, Agent Benjamin Hawkins, an American agent, would write, it is a pretty little compact town, beautifully situated. Both Hawkins and Bartram visited what they called the new town rather than the old town, which the old one had extensive old fields and abandoned plantations in the commons. In other words, all the old public structures were on the east side of the river, and the new town was across the way. Bartram describes the households that he visited. He declared Indian houses to be neat, commodious buildings with plastered walls over a wooden frame and a roof made from a wooden frame with cypress shingles, which isn't exactly your teepee that some people get in their head as what, Indians lived in. So he provides very exact details on the sizes and structure and architecture of the house. He further observed that every habitation consists of 4 oblong square houses of 1 story of the same form and dimensions, and so situated as to form an exact square, encompassing an area or courtyard of about 1/4 of an acre of ground, leaving an entrance into it at each corner. and he described the public buildings. And here you see Bartram's tried to draw the neighborhoods. And we know he elaborates later on. Here you see one of these little 4 squares. When people were first starting out, newly married, they might only have one little house. And as their family grew, they would add on a cookhouse, sleeping house, storehouse, that kind of thing. But the same sort of architecture as the public structures, only smaller in scale. For habitations. And so here we're going to talk about this a little bit. This is something called the Winter Council House or Rotunda. It's a circular building, winter house. And then here is something called the Public Square, where men of the village went every morning. Women kicked them out of the houses, and I think they were glad to get out of the houses, and all the men would congregate in the square. And this is something called the Chunky Yard, in which there were public dances, games, that sort of thing. And every creek town of any size and importance had those public structures, and usually in that same arrangement. And then the houses were here, and then the fields over here, and then something called the stickball field would be even further away, a big open area. So Bartram does a really good job of not only describing these, but thankfully he provided drawings. He found a really beautiful new square in the center of town, but he says, and that's another drawing of the square, and he provides exact descriptions of these buildings in which the Mikos of the town councilors would sit in this one. The important artifacts of the town were kept in this space behind here. And across from the civil leadership of the town, the military leadership, on one side the old men, on another the young men. And so you had this wonderful balance of civil, military, young, and old when the town men were discussing affairs. And he discusses all this stuff in his book. And he also notes that the stores of the traders were pretty far out, because that's where a lot of activity took place, dozens of horses, sometimes cattle and so forth. So all the noise and business was kept away from the town proper, because the creek square ground, then as now, was not a natural area. It was a very well-ordered arrangement of carefully delineated space that represented, in many ways, the spiritual cosmos of the Creek people. It was sanctified and regulated by the customs of men out of respect for the forces of nature. You had to behave a certain way. It was like going into church, in modern terms. Young children couldn't be running loose, screaming in there. Women didn't go. And so Bartram took a lot of time questioning the deerskin traders and asking Indians through interpreters about these things, about their religion. And he was a keen observer of the landscape. And he discusses the use of Indians' land, how they laid out agricultural fields, their hunt, how they went out on hunts, these kinds of things. And he noted these large common cornfields all along the riverbanks, as well as household gardens. Even more specific was an incredible experience he had at the neighboring town of Atasi. And here you see a council house at the bottom. And this is the spiral fire I'm about to discuss. And this is bench seating all around this structure. So he went to the rotunda at Otasi and joined the traders and the Creeks there for ceremonial black drink. And he described this rotunda as, and I'm quoting, a vast conical building or circular dome capable of accommodating many hundred people. And I think seldom in historic literature is it possible to find a more compelling description of an Indian ceremony than Bartram's measured cadence as he wrote about the solemn drama of the black drink ceremony at Atasi. And it began when 2 men entered the darkened rotunda, which was lit by, as he said, a cheerful, gentle, but sufficient light, which came from a spiral circle of dried cane bundles. And then they proceeded to serve the black drink, or casina. Now, black drink, I'm sure many of you have heard, is a famous ceremonial beverage of the southeastern Indians brewed from the leaves of the Ilex vomitoria, or the Yopon holly. And many of you probably have yopon in your yards or have seen it growing in the woods. But it makes a very good American tea, but the way the Indians, they parch the leaves and brewed it until it was really, really strong and had a dark black color. It was such a strong tea. Ironically, the Indians called it white drink because it was meant to purify. And botanists gave it the name Ilex vomitoria because after native people drank it, they would regurgitate it as a way to purify. So it doesn't cause you to vomit, but you can very easily vomit it. And I served it to plenty of my students, and some of them were not brave enough to always drink it. But you can now buy yopon tea on Amazon in various places. It's pretty good. But these singers, as they're often called, were actually important officials who prepared and served the sacred tea. And many of you probably know the most famous Yahola singer of them all in American history. And who would that, does anybody know who I'm talking about? How about Osceola? The famous, we call him a Seminole, but he was born near what's now Tuskegee, Alabama, and that was his role as the ceremonial server of the black drink. So Osceola, Yahola being singers. Okay. Now, of special interest here is something quite special that Bartram offers to us, which is an inkling of how the Creek world sounded. Because as he watched the Yahola singers offer up black drink from conch shells, he described their advance, as he put it, in slow, uniform, steady steps, their eyes or countenance uplifted, singing very low but sweetly. And he continues a very long discussion of this ceremony, noting that as the headman took the shell to drink, the singers sing 2 notes, each of which continues as long as he has breath, and as long as these notes continue, so long must the person drink, or at least keep the shell to his mouth. These 2 long notes are very solemn, and at once strike the imagination with a religious awe or homage to the Supreme Being, sounding somewhat like Ahu Aja and Alleluia. And I think you can see from that why many Westerners or Christians thought they were singing Alleluia. It's very much like that. James Adair in his book went to great deal of trouble to try to link that to a Jewish origin from the native people based on, the black drink singers. Well, that's not the case. It's just Muskogee language that he was hearing. But Bartram's account of his night taking black drink and smoking native tobacco provide modern people not only with a beautiful and moving account of this ceremony, but details on the architecture and interior designs of the wall. He left an account, which is the only one you'll find, of what he called the paintings on the interior walls of the house, and he gave exact descriptions of how in some squares the walls were plastered white and the drawings were red, and others the plaster was red with clay and the drawings were white. These are red and white towns, and he describes pictures from Creek mythology that you see on the walls. And I'm not going to read that long account to you, but I'm going to direct you, as I have previously, to read Travels, and read it slowly, because Bartram will take you to a place you can imagine today very easily when you read his words, and it's a wonderful book. When he was in the Creek town on the Chattahoochee, at the town called Apalachicola, he visited a man called Bosun by the traders. Bosun was a Creek man involved in the deerskin trade, and like Germany's family, he held African Americans in slavery too. And Bartram does detail the holding of people in slavery by the Indians, some African American, some from other tribes. It's a kind of a different kind of slavery, but slavery is slavery if you don't have your freedom and you can't be a functioning member of society without someone giving you permission to move from place to place. Like Germany, Bosun's plantation was annoying to others and therefore some distance from the town. Now, Bosun invited Bartram to come over and have breakfast at his place. And so Bartram did and provided us a drawing. And here you see this square, and this is quite different. It's a bigger establishment than most households. Here you see a square with a covered roof. That's what Bartram called the pavilion, and that's where Bosun received guests. And he has a warehouse, a cookhouse, and then, of course, a lodging house. And so he gives a great deal of detail about how these individual habitations were laid out. And for breakfast, Bosun's slaves served Bartram what he called excellent coffee in china dishes. Now wrap your head around that. That's a very traditional architecture, and here you have enslaved African Americans serving coffee out of china cups to a visiting botanist from Philadelphia, which is not exactly something we often think about happening in the Indian country, right? Both the coffee and the china represented luxury goods from afar. This was the high point of the Creek consumer economy. And Bosun's crockery and beverages were vastly different from the brewed leaves of yopon holly, which had been served from a conch shell, but his home was traditional. And speaking of that coffee, I remind you of what the date is. A few years earlier, I'm sure there would have been tea in those cups. But Americans were, tea was hard to get by that time, if not impossible, but were increasingly turning to coffee as a political statement, something I'm sure we can all relate to in our modern world, having seen people pour out French wine and avoid French fries and that sort of thing when we get mad at the French or whatever. So Bartram's night on the town in Atassi and his exceptionally stylish breakfast were not his only striking moments among the Creeks. On his return from West Florida before both of these other events, he provides what is perhaps my favorite passage in travels. He gives an incredible account of crossing a swollen creek, a tributary of the Alabama River, just before, when he was coming back from the Mississippi River, and just before he gets to the creek towns on the Tallapoosa, all the other traders go ahead and leave Bartram and a young Creek man in charge of the horses, because he's the lowest guy on the totem pole, and they say, get all the goods to the town. We're going to town to see our wives and all that kind of stuff. And so Bartram has to help this young man build a raft. And for a historian who studies trade and transportation, his detailed instructions on how they built these rafts is not only entertaining, but very informative, and it's very long. And again, I'll refer you to, if you're interested in building a raft to get across a 50-foot swollen creek, Bartram's your go-to how to do it guide. Now, in this little passage, Bartram also lets slip his humor, because when the young man, they built the raft, they load all the goods they've got up from Mobile on the raft and get it across the river, so that obviously they don't want to get their merchandise wet. And then the young man strips naked and swims across the river, right? And puts his clothes on the raft because he didn't want to get his clothes wet either. Bartram kept his pants on when he swam across the river. He did not lack a sense of humor, and he wrote in Travels, I stripped off except for my breeches, for they contain matters of more value and consequence than all the rest of my property put together. Besides, I did not choose to expose myself entirely naked to alligators and serpents crossing the flood. A delightful country indeed, and I might say that piqued my interest in alligators in Alabama River and Bartram's descriptions of alligators. In my latest book, I left the Indians and I wrote a piece called Wrestling with Bartram's Alligators, and I had a lot of fun doing that. Bartram's companion really interests me as much as that raft, and it's very instructive, because he was what Bartram describes as a young, musty Creek, M-U-S-T-E-E. By young, musty, Bartram meant a young man of mixed Indian-European ancestry. That's the sort of the English word for mestizo. So that young man revealed many things about Creek life. His mother had been a Choctaw slave. She had been enslaved by the Creek Indians and had married a Creek man. She had been captured by the Creeks in the many wars against the Creek Choctaw Wars, and she'd been brought back and eventually married a Creek man. His father, said Bartram, used to use the common language of the 18th century, was a half-breed, a cross between a Creek and a white man. Now, we don't use those racial terms anymore, like half-breed or half-blood, but instead prefer to describe these people of mixed marriages as bicultural people, people who had a foot in two different cultures. And here you have a man who had English and Creek ancestry from his father and was a Choctaw on his mother's side. And I think he's not alone. There are many, many of these kinds of individuals in the Creek Nation by this time. They are from mixed ethnic and political backgrounds, but they were part of a new reality in Creek country, a lot of mixing and mingling, just like in the American colonies, when African Americans and Europeans were intermarrying, and there were plenty of Afro Creeks as well. Now, this particular young man who taught Bartram how to construct that raft using very traditional methods, was following his father's footsteps and worked as a deerskin trader. But from his mother's people, he learned to construct the raft. From his father, Bartram says, he has been instructed in reading, writing, and arithmetic, and could speak English very well. So this is a new kind of Creek man, engaged in business, adapting to the new world, this is kind of what you can see if you had gotten into the town with Bartram and this young man. Now, this is a little diorama that's at the Alabama Department of Archives and History and was based on Bartram's town description as well. And all that, by the way, has been confirmed by archaeological work. And so they have this wonderful little diorama showing the square ground and the rotunda and even a trader's store. So if you get a chance, look at that. Now, once they got everything across the river and Bartram dried his pants, they attended the young man's wedding at the Creek town of Muckalosas, and he was marrying well. His bride was the daughter of the headman of the town and the sister of the resident British trader's wife. So he's marrying into a family with political and economic clout. And his wife, of course, is going to own the goods in the store and stuff, but he would have understood that. And I think in that young couple, Bartram had visual proof of the strength of kinship traditions and the importance of trade connections. He also saw before his eyes the mixing of cultures and destinies as a result of territorial war and the quest for trade goods, as well as the impact these material goods and ideas had wrought on the native South. And he gives us descriptions of everything: their clothing, their songs, their dances, their homes, the very complex world in which they live. And here's another thing about this young man. This is how he ended up on the trip with Bartram from Mobile. Prior to that, as Bartram put it, he had gotten it to his head to visit the Choctaw. He wanted to go to the Choctaw Nation because that had been his mother's people. Remember, she was captured in a previous war. I'm figuring he was probably about 20 years old, 18 to 20 years old, and he just wanted to go see what the Choctaw Nation was about. Well, he got there and stayed a very short while, but the Choctaw figured out pretty fast what was going on and pronounced him, according to Bartram, an enemy and a spy due to his Creek ancestry and the fact the Creeks and the Choctaw were at war. And he had to flee the Creek Nation, the Choctaw Nation, in fear of his life, which is how he ended up on that caravan of deerskin traders as the lowest man on the totem pole. But while he was there, before they found him out, he learned a few Choctaw songs and dances, which he performed for the crowd at his wedding. They were always interested in new songs and dances. Now, in attendance at this wedding was another young Choctaw slave girl. Bartram wrote that the songs brought tears to her eyes as she remembered her recently slain father and two brothers who had been killed in battle with the Creeks. Bartram reported that the Creek Indians around her complimented her with sympathetic sighs and tears, so they were all very sorry. Oh, we understand you've lost, because they were in the same situation. They had relatives among the Choctaw. And here's something very important that Bartram did. He asked that young man, "What are you singing?" And he provided translated lyrics of the song the man had sung. And here's what Bartram wrote. The young man was singing, "All men must surely die, though no one knows how soon. Yet when the time shall come, the event may be joyful." And for a warrior, that would have been to die in warfare, and you're assured a place in heaven is what we would think of as heaven is a heroic death. So take all that in. Here you've got a traveler in the 18th century South talking about wars, love, marriage, sadness, enslavement, ceremony, singing, tradition, and most importantly, detailing the changes that were there. And Bartram also got a gift while he was at Muckalosas, and he drew that too. That little pipe is a drawing of his. And so for this historian, particularly this one, Bartram's account of all aspects of the deerskin trade are essential to our understanding the commerce. He details not just that, but the holistic picture of who he saw and who he visited, and in a way that no other sources do. And I want to say that Bartram's work is widespread. This is a drawing from an early 19th century Dutch work on anthropology, and they quote Bartram extensively. Obviously, it's a Dutch translation, but they even had an artist draw a depiction of what a Creek Indian would look like based on Bartram's language, his descriptions, and they do a pretty good job of the trade cloth of the woman. The musket's not right, neither are those trees or the wheat, but there you see an attempt to replicate the houses and so forth. So you really can't overstate how important he was, because he documented native people, he documented the environment of the 18th century South, and as I've mentioned, by the time George Washington was elected president and they were looking around for someone who knew the Creek Indians, Bartram wrote a position piece for the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, called Hints on the Civilization. And it's really about the Creeks and how he thinks they would like to have Christian missionaries, that they would be willing to change their way of holding land, of doing all this stuff, and helped kick off the disastrous American foreign policy known as the Civilization Plan. But Bartram was in a good place when he was pushing it, because the alternative to civilization at that point was what was going on among the northern Indians, which was all-out war and taking land. So Bartram's influence cannot be overstated in any means or measure. And I'm running out of time, but I did want, let's see, back one, that one. If you're interested in his accounts of architecture, in this book, Fields of Vision, Craig Sheldon, an archaeologist, I'm going to take credit for it because I kind of twisted his arm and said, you got to write it. Did something called Where Bartram Sat, and he looks at the architecture of Bartram and compares it to known sites where they've excavated. And Bartram was pretty much spot on. He was not making it up. His account is confirmed not only by a few other sources, but by archaeology. And I have one in that piece on Bartram's many meals that he had across the Creek Nation and across the South during that time. So you might enjoy that. And with that, I think I'll stop and let you ask questions. Thank you. All right, the question was, in the event of the Choctaw slave, who owns the property? These people captured in warfare were generally taken back to the towns, and usually they were either women or young children. Men or boys are too hard to handle, and so they are given an honorable death. Sometimes, in fact, Bartram draws what he calls slave poles in the chunky yard. So if you capture a warrior and you take it back to town, they basically torture and kill the warriors there. But the women and children would have been adopted, and usually what happens is they're given to a family who has lost another member, and so they can use them how they wish. They have absolutely no rights in Creek society, which is the very definition of enslavement. And what generally happens in the Creek world is sooner or later somebody will marry into a family or will be adopted by someone and kind of get a fictive clan going. The problem with this young mustee that Bartram travels with is interesting, and he doesn't provide us enough information to know what's happening there. But since that that boy's mother was not a Creek, technically he didn't have a Creek clan, but I suspect what had happened was that he had been adopted into a Creek family and considered a son, and so the Creeks are very, malleable in that way and would have accepted him. In some cases, particularly in the 19th century, where they had captured, and in fact, during the American Revolution, a lot of children were captured by Creek raids into Georgia and so forth, and later into Tennessee, African American and white children. And in some cases, those children were ransomed. You could get a lot of money for them. In some cases, deerskin traders would buy them and then, seek compensation. And in some cases, they simply grew up with the Creeks and then went back to their families as adults. But some simply stayed because they'd grown up or had family and so forth. It's a very, there's no one answer to that. It's a very complicated world. Any other questions?
And then when the Trail of Tears started, all of this was wiped out.
So the comment was when the Trail of Tears started, all this was wiped out. Well, in the Creek country, what you have to think of is these beautiful Creek towns. Almost every town I'm just going to say every town in the Creek Nation was destroyed in the Creek War. They were all burned by one side or the other. And so after 1814, there was massive rebuilding and reshuffling. And then in the 1820s, when the Creeks lost their land in Georgia, a lot of Creeks who were in towns east of the Chattahoochee, or on what we would think of now as the Georgia side of the Chattahoochee, had to relocate. And so they're new towns. And also, by the 1820s, late 20s, right on the verge of removal, they're beginning to keep quite a lot of cattle and so forth. So the towns are breaking up, and that was part of the American civilization policy, to get people to move out of these clustered areas away from the control of the chiefs, as it were. And so a lot of people were moving out. So yes, it was vastly changed by that time. And then the Creek Treaty, the removal treaty, took, by that treaty, I'm just going to give you the short version of this, the Creek Nation ceded all of their land to the United States government, and in return, each head of household was awarded a smaller parcel as individual property. And the Creeks were supposed to be allowed to keep that, either to sell for their own profit and go to Indian Territory, or to be able to keep it and remain on their land. And there were so many frauds that was just basically a great big land steal. And so the Creek Nation, by just within a few years after Bartram left, was vastly different. Any more questions?
Did he take any plants back to England, to his, the plants that he found here in this part, he was supposed to take back to England to his father or whatever that
Yeah.
man was?
Okay, so the question was, did he take any plants back? And he did not go back to England. He went back to Philadelphia. But the answer to your question is yes. He collected specimens and dried specimens. In fact, one of his main discoveries, I think one of the most beautiful, is called the large flowering evening primrose, which is native only in the Tensile Delta of Alabama. And it's a fascinating story about that plant. But he sent seeds, and he did drawings, and he dried specimens. His most famous botanical discovery, let's see. What's going on? Can we advance the slide? There is a tree called the Franklinia tree, the Ben Franklin tree, which is a beautiful flowering tree. It's a member of the tea family, now extinct in the wild in the South, but he found it in Georgia. And so he obviously collected seeds, and at his father's nursery, they did grow some of these plants and export them, but the American Revolution kind of messed up that business. But after the war, a lot of the Bartram plants went to France. But they had an enormous catalog of seeds and shrubs and things that wealthy people could buy, and they would be shipped over. But he did ship specimens from Charleston and from Savannah, and he shipped some out of Mobile when he was there, left them in care of merchants, and so they got back. And all of his plant dried specimens and drawings that went to Dr. Fothergill are now owned by the British Museum, so, or almost all of them. Yes, ma'am.
You talked a while ago about the Trail of Tears. You talked as though they had an option.
Yes.
Did they have an option?
Technically, they were supposed to have an option. The reality was this: under the treaty, the United States government was bound to protect Creek land ownership, and there was an enormous census made of every head of household, and of course, the heads of household were men. Americans are patrilineal society. Creeks were matrilineal, in which the matrilineal inheritance was through the matrilineal line. So the Americans got every man who was a head of a family, or a widow, if you will, or an orphan, and they were given a certain amount of land to be theirs. And they were bound to protect that under law. Alabamians told the federal government, yeah, well, you're going to send the army down. And so individual Creeks were harassed. There was incredible frauds. And so in the end, you either had really no choice at all. Specifically, after a series of attacks by some Indians near Columbus and Eufaula on the Chattahoochee, who were so tired of the abuse they were getting that they actually attacked some stagecoaches and so forth, then the United States government used that as an excuse to send in the army and forcibly remove the hostiles and say, the deal's off, everybody has to go. So it was not really a choice, and it's a sort of an ugly account of American history and the federal government not doing what they said they would do. And I'm not going to blame it all on Andrew Jackson, because Alabamians and Georgians and ordinary citizens were the one leading the thrust to get rid of the Creeks. They were the ones going in, burning Creek houses down, stealing their cattle, stealing their horses, and the sheriff would say, well, they're an Indian, yeah. No, who cares? And so you really, for preservation, you had no choice in the end, although many did stay. If they were married to white people, and many were married to African Americans who were they were kept and enslaved. And so you have incredible numbers of people of Creek ancestry who stayed behind in enslavement, or who went into inaccessible areas and just, laid low and didn't go to town and that sort of thing. If you were a man with a Creek wife, maybe she, I've heard these stories, great-grandmother, they always said she would never go to town, that kind of thing. So there are a lot of Creeks who didn't remove, but it was not a kind of wholesome existence for a while. On the other hand, if you were wealthy, as some were, you could blend right in and apply to the state legislature for citizenship. So.
Familiar with the term Black Dutch? Several different definitions, and I don't know which one is correct. I've heard it's Indians that claim that they're Germanic and dark complected.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't.
Well, I can kind of give you a short answer, and that's not my real area of expertise, but the notion is, in the scheme of racial animosity, in which white is at the top and black is at the bottom, it's better to be, as the Creeks would have said, a Spaniard or a German or whatever, than African American, and that was a way to get around Indian prejudice. I'll also point out that there was a lot of intermarriage between Native Americans and African Americans, and that race simply did not matter in the early 18th century world. What matters was your clan and your family. Race wasn't an issue, it was kinship, not race. And the racism issue becomes very, very pronounced after the Revolution, and I think that's when that emerges.
We have any more questions? Dr. Braund, thank you so much.
Having me. It's always wonderful to come to Sylacauga. You really have, I want to say this, you really have one of the finest libraries in the state. I don't know. I hope you appreciate what you do have. It's a wonderful, wonderful place.
Thank you. Thank you. I was just sitting there trying to think, Dr. Braun, how many years you've been coming to do brown bag programs for us. It's been a long time. And so we're very, very fortunate here in Sylacauga that we have historians of the caliber of Dr. Braun that are willing to continue coming and being a part of our series. So thank you again for all that you do. Thank you. Okay, next week we have Elnora Spencer. So I know that you all have seen Miss Elnora. She is a fantastic singer. Jazzy blues is what she calls her style. She brings some fantastic musicians with her. We will have her program. But then I wanted to mention something else to you. Some friends of Miss Polly Bell Banks. A lot of y'all know Miss Polly Banks. She has been putting writings together for years, and a couple of her friends have helped her get this book published, and they're going to sponsor a event for her where she's actually going to speak. They're going to have some of her books for sale. That'll be across the hall. So the Elnora program will run from 12 to 1. When this program is over, you'll go across the hall if you would like to stay and participate and see Miss Polly. It'll be across the hall in the high tower room, and that'll be open at 1 o'clock. And she's going to speak and do a little presentation and just a little reading from her book about 1:30. So we would love for you to stay. Mr. Wayne Hall, Mr. John Floyd have just been such a big part of making sure that her writings get celebrated the right way. And so they are sponsoring this event for her, and we'd love to invite you to stay for that next week. One last thank you to First Bank of Alabama, to our sweet volunteers, to Coosa Valley Medical Center's Hickory Street Cafe, to Dr. Shirley Spears with the Library Foundation, and to you so much, thank you for coming out today. Dr. Braun, thank you again, and we will see you next week.